I have a great topic to talk about today, a topic that I get many questions about, and there's lots of different answers we can give. And that is, what do we do with the joints, expansion joints in epoxy floors? Should we cover them? Do we cover them? I'm going to start you off with this picture. This was a picture of a floor where we had already primed it, and I've got someone filling in the joints because afterwards we're going to coat over the floor. So, before I answer your questions, the main thing we need to understand is there's two types of joints. We have the concrete floor joints. These are the joints in the concrete, and the structural joints, the building joints. These are the joints that are part of a bigger building. Now, I understand that many people use different words and terms for these joints. We have an international audience in this channel, so I'm trying to use as general terms as possible. And I'm now going to go and explain these two types of joints and when we should cover them and when we shouldn't. So I'll start with the most common type of joint, and these are the concrete floor joints. So this is after we do our concrete troweling, and then someone goes in as the concrete is curing, and we cut joints, usually at 5 by 5 meter intervals or maybe 8 by 8. The whole purpose here is to allow movement of the concrete floor. So you're going to have contractions and expansions of the floor depending on the temperature, and you want to allow those joints, otherwise you'll get cracks in the concrete. Here's an example of someone who painted an epoxy and kind of painted over the joints without really sealing them. And as a result, the joints got kind of dirty, which isn't very pretty. Now, some people prefer to leave them uncovered. In other cases, like in this case, they didn't want joints visible. So the customer here, he wanted a self-leveling epoxy floor. He wanted the seamless look, and he says, I don't want any joints. And that is usually the case in most epoxy floors. The big advantage of an epoxy floor is you don't want to have any seams or joints visible. So, and one more point to add here is, especially if you are working with food manufacturing, like most of my customers are in food manufacturing or pharmaceuticals, they don't want joints. They get inspectors all the time. They want the floor to be squeaky clean and no place where some sort of dirt could gather. And here's another example of a seamless floor. This floor was an old industrial kitchen. And it's actually a very high status, I'd say, high profile restaurant in Athens. And they did not want any sort of joints visible in the floor, because they would have inspectors coming in telling them off that the joints were gathering dirt. So we did a seamless floor. We covered the joints. And the next question is, all right, so we agree that in these floor joints, we do not, in most cases, we want to fill them up and then you want to cover with epoxy. So what type of product do you use to fill them up? Because there's lots of disagreement and confusion here. And I don't believe in giving you one type of product that's suitable. But what I'll tell you is, if you are going to fill your joints, you need three things. The filling material or the patching product or the sealant, it needs to be one. It needs to be tough. It needs to be tough because people are going to walk on the floor. People are going to drive over the floor. You might have pallet trucks or people moving pallets. So it needs to be tough. Number two, it needs to be flexible. Some flexibility. Doesn't need to be very flexible, but keep in mind, this concrete is going to expand and contract depending on the time of the year. So you definitely want some flexibility so that this filling product, this patching product can withstand these contractions and expansions. And number three, and this is very important and I'm going to show you why in a minute, it needs to be paintable. You are going to coat over this joint. So whatever you're going to put over it, it needs to stick to the joint, to the sealant in the joint. And here is the exact same floor as in the previous picture. Here's the first example. Here we see him filling up the joints, and here we see the seamless epoxy floor on top. Now, important point, many people want to use epoxy to fill joints. The problem with most epoxy patching kits is they are not flexible. Epoxy by nature is a rigid material. It's tough, but it's not very flexible. So that's why I don't necessarily recommend epoxy. I know there are some epoxies that are a bit more flexible, but in general, I would recommend that you use something a bit more flexible for your joints. In my personal experience, the best types of sealants to close joints are polyurethane or hybrid MS polymer sealants. And again, make sure they are paintable and they are elastic, and they are tough. And another important point is you do not want to be using acrylics. Let me go back to this picture. You do not want to be using acrylics. And why? Because acrylics are not tough. Acrylics we use to seal our bathroom sink. We use to seal the mirror behind the bathroom. They're very good for that job, but you want something a bit sturdier because we are talking about a floor here. So let's move on now. And here's what I wanted to talk about: non-paintable sealant. I've talked about this in another video, my disaster video. I'll post a link if you want to learn more about disasters. But what happened here was someone on my team said he had a leftover sealant in his car. So he didn't realize it was a silicone sealant and it was non-paintable. So he went ahead and filled some joints up with silicone sealant. This was an anti-mold bathroom sealant. And what ended up happening was when he then applied the primer over that area, notice how the area around the joint, the primer's kind of been repelled. It never really stuck to the floor. And why? Because it was a non-paintable sealant. This is why it's so important. If you are going to buy some sort of joint sealant, make sure it's paintable, because you are going to need to paint over it with the primer, with the epoxy, with whatever you put on top. So make sure it's paintable. Very, very important. Before I go on to the structural joints, please take a moment and subscribe to the channel. It helps me keep on bringing new videos and new content. Thank you very much. Right, now we're going to talk about the structural building joints. These are the joints that are kind of part of the building. They've been built into the building. They weren't laid down. They weren't cut later when the concrete was poured. This is part of the actual structure of the building. And here's an example. Notice the red arrow. The red arrow is where we are actually applying a floor and there is a joint going down along the floor. There's a metal joint covering separating the two slabs. And notice something in the black arrow on top. The same joint covering is continuing along the walls. And that's a great way to tell if when you are applying, when you have a joint, if it's also a building joint. Because a lot of times customers kind of expect you to cover all the joints and you tell them, look, I can't cover this joint because it's a building joint. And always show them the wall, because by looking at the wall, you can either see a crack in the wall or you can see some sort of joint covering going up the wall. And that tells the customer, this is a joint, this is part of the building, you should not be covering this. Or when I say not be covering, you can use a metal covering like this one to cover the joint, but you should not be using some sort of epoxy to fill the joint up. A few things about building joints that are important. They are much wider, so they tend to be up to 2 centimeters or 1 inch in width, compared to the concrete floor joints that tend to be about 0.5 centimeter. They tend to be deep, so they go right through the slab. They're not just kind of they go right through the floor, and the reason is you want the entire building to be moving. And as I said before, they go up the walls and the ceiling. It's an important point, so you understand why they're there in place. And I am going to go to this picture now, and I have a story to tell that I'm not very proud of. But what happened here was I had a customer many, many years ago when I was starting out, and he insisted that I cover a building joint. Now, I was inexperienced at the time, and also I wasn't very good at saying no to customers. This customer was very pushy, very toxic, the type of people I don't work with anymore. But anyway, he insisted that I cover the joint, even though I told him he shouldn't. So I went along and covered the joint. And what happened was, a few months later, this crack emerged. That's the blue arrow. So this crack emerged, and that was a blue arrow. And then he called me and he complained about the crack, and I told him, well, that was because we covered the joint that you wanted to cover. Of course, he did not even agree that he'd said that. He kind of blamed me for it. He was one of those people. So what we did then was we came in and using a cutting disc, we cut a new joint. That's the green arrow. So at least now there is some movement. But I would generally recommend avoid doing anything to building joints with epoxy. If you are going to cover building joints, use a proper joint covering. And a few points I've put in the bullets. If you epoxy over structural joints, they will crack. building joints need to be left open to move. They need to be moving. And most sealants are not suitable. So going back to my previous examples of what type of sealants to use, sealants are good for small thicknesses. Most sealants are not suitable to fill a joint of 2 centimeters in width. It's just too much. It's just too much. Leave them open. Of course, the solution is you can cover them with a joint covering, like in this example. So a joint covering is usually a sheet of metal that you kind of put and you nail on both. You kind of put over the joint, and you make sure it's able to move somehow. So sometimes the joint covering itself is composed of 2 pieces, and the metal moves, or you just nail one side and you leave the other side flexible so it can move. I'm not going to go into details of how to adjust a joint covering, but the whole idea here is you want to allow movement. And as in this picture here with a young Cristiano Ronaldo, this was a project we did many years ago. So we did both sides of the epoxy floor, and we left the joint covering in the middle untouched. And that's how you should be doing floors when you have structural joints. You want to avoid covering them, because what ends up happening is they crack and you get damage along the joints, and it looks worse than before. So I'm going to post a few more links. You can we mentioned today about self-leveling floors and disaster videos. Thank you very much for watching. Also, you can check out our online course where we've got lots of great information, and more students are signing up, and I'm getting lots of great emails and lots of feedback from people telling me how much they've learned through this course. So definitely check out our online course. Thank you very much for watching, and please remember, if you think someone can benefit from this video, please share it along. Thank you.